Hello everybody, and finally I've been given permission to release this review video for the German Tier 8 premium battleship, the Tirpitz. And hopefully by the end of this video you're going to know whether it is worth it or not to purchase this absolutely gorgeous battleship. Now, like many of my other review videos, what I will be doing is going over the ship statistics and how they compare to other Tier 8 battleships in the game. I'll also be going over recommended modules as well as recommended captain skills for this particular ship. Once that's all said and done, I will probably show you a few clips of gameplay just to show you how she performs in game. So without much further hesitation, let's get going. In terms of survivability, I found the Tirpitz to be a very good battleship. First of all, its HP pool is quite large at 69,300. This gives the Tirpitz more HP than both the fully upgraded North Carolina and the fully upgraded Amagi. Although when you compare it to the stock hulls for the North Carolina and Amagi, then the Tirpitz has substantially more HP. While I don't have the numbers for the armor right now, my experience in game does seem to indicate that the Tirpitz's armor is quite good. I found the ship not very easy to citadel, not only that, but I also found the ship to be quite resistant to HE damage, and she can really take a lot of punishment. So while I don't have the actual numbers, anecdotal evidence suggests that the Tirpitz definitely is a very well protected ship and is definitely not very easy to sink. The Tirpitz's main armament is where things get a little bit interesting. The Tirpitz carries 4 of these dual 380mm guns, and these guns reach out to a maximum range of 21.4 kilometers, which in terms of range is actually respectable. It's more range than the Amagi gets, but it's slightly less range than the fully upgraded North Carolina. But these main guns are interesting in the sense that they have a very good rate of fire, 2.3 rounds a minute, which means that the Tirpitz is able to get off one salvo every 26 seconds. This is better than almost any other battleship at this upper tier. Not only that, the guns also traverse very quickly. They're able to do 180-degree turn time in 36 seconds, which is very good and allows you to have your guns on target all the time. But there are 2 flaws with the Tirpitz's guns. One, the max dispersion is not very good at all. 276 meter dispersion at 21.4 kilometers is not very good at all. In fact, the Yamato has the same dispersion but out to something like 26 some odd kilometers. So the Tirpitz's dispersion is definitely one of her weaknesses, and when you fire her main guns you will tend to see a bit of a shotgun effect, and trying to hit stuff accurately at long range is not always that possible. So I find that this is one of the things that is not very good on the Tirpitz. But even if you are able to hit, and this is the second problem with the Tirpitz's guns, is that when you do hit and you do citadel, your damage output is not very good, only 11,300. You're doing approximately 1,000 damage less than the Amagi's main guns, and you're also doing almost 2,000 damage less than the North Carolina's main guns. So I think that when it comes to actual damage, the alpha damage of these guns are not very good, although I think in terms of DPM they are fantastic, which will be interesting because I'll raise how this particular DPM might actually be useful later on. In terms of secondary guns, the Tirpitz is actually really good. She has a lot of secondary guns, and every time I see myself getting within close range of something else, I do definitely see the secondary guns going off and spraying out quite a lot of shells. So I think that when it comes to guarding yourself against smaller ships that do get up close, maybe like a destroyer or whatever, the secondary guns are definitely useful. Not only that, but the Tirpitz has one last trick up its sleeve that other battleships in the game do not have, which are these torpedo tubes right here. The Tirpitz has 2 quad launchers, one on each side, and these give the Tirpitz a very sort of up close and personal surprise kind of weapon. These torpedoes reload in 90 seconds. They traverse relatively fast. They do decent damage, 13,700 max damage. They're pretty fast at 64 knots, and they only go out to about 6 kilometers, but like I said, I mean, they're kind of last ditch weapons. The one problem with these torpedoes is actually where they're placed. If you look at where the torpedoes are on the ship, they're kind of close to the middle area, and the middle area is where a lot of other ships will be shooting to try to hit your citadel. So this means that what I found often in my own battles is that the torpedoes tend to get knocked out quite easily, which means sometimes when you're actually depending on the weapons to go into a close range torpedo run, one salvo and then all of a sudden you've lost your torpedo. So these weapons are nice to have, but you can't always depend on them. But they are nice to have. You can occasionally surprise ships up close. One time, I believe, during one of my battles, I even surprised an eye, which just sort of went, got close, and the eye was like, oh, okay, you're going to evade me. Oh, torpedoes in the water. And yeah, the eye wasn't too happy about that. But it is definitely one of those weapons that does give you options. But of course, we have to discuss one of the biggest flaws with the Tirpitz, and that lies within its AA. The Tirpitz's AA is, well, to put it nicely, really, really weak. To put it in any other way, it's kind of pathetic. And here's the reason why. The majority of the Tirpitz's AA's DPS lies within these 20mm guns that you see over here, these 20mm flak 38s, in both the single mounts and of course these quad mounts. And these guns only reach out to 2.1 kilometers, and with the way that carrier aircraft are right now and the range at which they drop their weapons, the main part of your DPS never really even gets involved in attacking aircraft unless of course they fly right over you. But the AA just doesn't do that much. Your long range AA, which are these 37mm guns that you see over here, and of course the 105mm guns, they don't do a lot of damage. They do go out a bit further, but their damage is really, really, really poor. So this makes the Tirpitz, honestly, a pretty easy target to attack from the air, and the Tirpitz really requires quite a lot of support from cruisers in order to stay alive. However, I did mention survivability earlier, and I have to mention this again. The Tirpitz is very durable, and so as long as you're able to be intelligent when it comes to defending yourself against air attack, you are able to mitigate a lot of damage, and you can actually slug it out for quite a little bit longer. The Tirpitz's biggest asset, in my opinion, is its speed. The Tirpitz's max speed of 30.9 knots is gonna make it currently the fastest battleship in the game. This is gonna allow the Tirpitz to keep up with cruisers, and I think that the poor AA of the Tirpitz is partially going to be mitigated by the ability for this particular ship to keep up with cruiser escorts, because a lot of times what ends up happening is that in some confusion with attacks going on or whatever, the cruisers accelerate to full speed and then they just run off, and in most battleships you're never going to be able to keep up with them. So I think this is one of the things about the Tirpitz that one has to use correctly, its speed. Not only that, but the Tirpitz's speed, it also gives it a chance to sort of act as like a heavy support for the cruisers, because unlike a lot of other battleships which will be way behind the action, the Tirpitz can kind of keep up, which means that when the cruisers get into trouble, you are able to support. And remember those fast-firing main guns the Tirpitz has? I think that's what those guns are really good for, is engaging other cruisers, killing them off quickly, and letting your cruisers push through. Not only that, but even when there is another battleship that pops up, the good armor and survivability of the ship is going to allow you to fight, even though you don't do as much damage. But again, with your DPM and with cruiser supporting, I think you can do a lot of damage with the Tirpitz. Finally, in terms of turning circle radius, rudder shift time, it's all pretty standard. Although the rudder shift time, from some things that I've read so far, it seems like the number is displayed incorrectly. So 20.9 seconds I think is a bit over what the ship actually has. In game, when I play her, the Tirpitz does seem to turn pretty quickly, and I never felt like it took 20 seconds for the rudder to shift. So I do think that that's an error, and I do think it'll be fixed eventually. The ship in game right now does turn pretty quickly. Finally, in terms of surface concealment and air detectability, the Tirpitz is perfectly fine. Very standard, 16.4 kilometer on the surface, 14.8 kilometers from the air. So that's all really, really standard. Overall, I think just statistically, the Tirpitz it's an interesting ship. It's actually not bad, but I mean, it's not going to be amazing. There are definite weaknesses, but those weaknesses I think can be mitigated by player skill. Let's take a look at the modules that I think should be equipped to the Tirpitz to make it a little bit better. In the first lot, I would definitely recommend getting the main battery modification 1. Once again, you don't want to have your main guns knocked out, and also not having a reduction in chance for the magazine detonation I think is pretty important. The second slot is where things can be interesting. Some people might want to get AA just to make the AA a little bit better. Don't get that. I think the main thing for the Tirpitz is definitely to improve the main guns, so get gunfire control system modification 1. That dispersion in the non-modified whatever version of the ship is definitely atrocious, so getting this will help make the shots a little bit more bearable. In the third slot, get damage control system modification 1. Again, reducing chances of flooding and fire is super important when in a battleship. In the fourth slot, get steering gears modification 2. and that's just to help the ship turn a little bit faster, because again, you're gonna need that agility to help you dodge torpedo aircraft and torpedoes. So that's something you should definitely have on your ship. In terms of modules, I think the three here in the middle are the three most essential modules to get. The first one you can get because it's relatively cheap. The last one you can kind of skip out on. If you are to get it, get Concealment System Modification 1, but it's not exactly the most important module. And for 2 million credits, it is pretty pricey. So if you're going to skip a module, you can skip the last one. Hell, I even had to do that because I didn't have enough credits. Anyways, okay, let's move on to the captain, because that's the last thing we do before we have to look at some battles. In terms of skills, in the first row, I would say there's a choice between either basic firing training or basics of survivability. I would personally opt for basics of survivability because I do find that the Tirpitz is very much dependent on its ability to survive. The basic firing training could be useful, but not really for the AA bonus, rather for the secondary bonus. Although again, I did find the Tirpitz's secondary guns to be quite good even without the skill, so maybe not that important. So if you had to choose one of the two, get basics of survivability. In the second row of skills, I would say get expert marksman. I know the guns do traverse quite quickly, but for the Tirpitz, when you do have to do quite a lot of maneuvering in order to dodge stuff, especially aircraft, this skill does come in handy to have your guns turn just that little bit faster. In the third row of skills, High Alert I think is quite a good pick because it provides you a 10% cooldown reduction to the damage control party consumable, which is very, very good because it allows you to fix fire and flooding a little bit sooner. Superintendent can be viable just so that you can actually get an extra charge of the HP repair consumable. So this could be a viable skill to get as well. Where the Tirpitz I think could be interesting is the decision whether to get the tier 4 and tier 5 skills or whether to simply get more of the tier 1 to 3. I think if I were to get more of the tier 1 to 3, I would definitely get basic firing training, as well as something like I might as well get something like situational awareness maybe, as well as either both of the two tier 3 skills, both High Alert and Superintendent. You could just get more of these basic level 1 to 3 skills. If you had to get one from the 4th tier, I would say advanced firing training is the only really useful one. And if you decide to push on and get the tier 5 skills, I think a lot of the tier 5 skills can be very interesting, although personally I prefer either Concealment Expert, Jack of all trades, or Last Chance. I think those would all be interestingly good skills to get. But one could definitely consider just simply getting tier 1 to 4 skills and then skipping all the tier 5s and just getting additional tier 1 to 3 skills. I actually think that the Tirpitz might actually perform better by having just more skills than simply having the more expensive 5th row skills. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Okay, let's take a look at the Tirpitz in actual battle, because nothing's going to tell you how effective a ship is except to see it in combat with other ships. Alright, so let's take a look at this battle that happened on Hotspot. First things first that I want you to take a look at is the minimap. As you can see, I am actually very, very close to where my cruisers are, and I mentioned this earlier. The Tirpitz's great speed does allow you to keep pretty much on pace with your cruisers. You'll be a little bit behind, but you're pretty much keeping pace with them. And this is very, very useful because when the cruisers run off, like they've kind of done here, they at least have a battleship to lend them its heavy guns. So in this particular case, there is a battleship on the enemy team that's still down here, an Izumo. But that Izumo can't always turn around and engage me because he's going to take tons of damage from the cruisers. He also can turn around to really engage the cruisers because then he's got to deal with my guns. So this put that Izumo in a pretty difficult situation, and most of the time that Izumo just ended up kind of running away. During this period of time, I'm letting the cruiser essentially take care of this Izumo because the Izumo doesn't really have a lot of HP left. But I am basically spending my time killing off that Shokaku as quickly as possible. And once again, that's because the Tirpitz's vulnerability to aircraft. So, the faster I can take down a carrier, the less likely I am to take damage from it, and the less likely I am to die. So, I've already knocked the carrier down quite a lot, and with a few thousand more HP, the cruisers are going to pretty much finish off that carrier. Take a look at the map now. The enemy team has pretty much wiped out most of the ships that were on our northern area, and so they're coming down south. We're just going to sort of play cleanup here and take care of everything else that's already down here, which is namely that Atago over there. While the Tirpitz, as I mentioned earlier, isn't great on a battleship engagement because of the low citadel damage, it does perfectly fine against cruisers, as you will see here. So that Atago is taking quite a bit of damage, and very easily citadel target hit, and I finish it off. The thing that worries me now on this team, this enemy team, is actually that Iowa, because the Iowa at tier 9 has armor that, as long as it's angled, is near impossible for Tirpitz to penetrate. And so that Iowa is really going to have to, it's going to have to be taken care of in rather more interesting ways. But again, in this particular shot as well, look at this. See, against cruisers, the Tirpitz really doesn't have too much problems. It can take care of cruisers with ease. And with the extra rate of fire on these particular battleship guns, a lot of times you will catch cruisers unaware because you're firing that much faster compared to every other battleship that they're normally faced up against. So it is definitely a huge advantage with this particular rate of fire to engage cruisers. Battleships, it's not that going to be that great because, again, with the armor, a lot of times you won't really penetrate, especially at tier 9, tier 10. Okay, so the Iowa's over there, and it's nearly a full HP Iowa, and as you'll see from my next, I think, 2 salvos, I'm really not going to penetrate anything onto that Iowa because he is so heavily angled. Not only that, but in case you've been paying attention to the dispersion of my shells, it's kind of wild. The Tirpitz's dispersion is a little bit sort of like really wide, and it's kind of all over the place a little bit, and that's one of my biggest gripes, I guess, with the ship. But I mean, she's definitely playable, and I do perfectly fine with the ship when I do play her, but it does kind of drive you nuts sometimes. You'll fire a salvo that you think should hit, and it just goes nowhere that you want it to go. Anyways, as you can see, 2 salvos, like nothing. The Iowa is just bouncing these shots because of how angled it is. Nevertheless, there is a way to deal with battleships like this when you're in a Tirpitz that you might not have that option with other battleships. Yamato, of course, you might because your guns have such high penetration, but a lot of other battleships, this would be a tough nut to crack. But with the Tirpitz and the fact that it has torpedoes, it gives you another option. It gives you an option to, maintain your angle to the battleship, close range, and then use your torpedoes. Once again, enemy cruiser. I love the Tirpitz. For this particular thing, I love it. She's absolutely great when dealing with cruisers. 2 citadels, 15,000 damage, backed myself in Tago. But this next shot is glorious. The Iowa, which had seen torpedoes from my team heading towards it earlier, decided to try to run away. Not only that, but I'm pretty sure this Iowa was aware of the fact that I also had torps on my ship. But by turning his broadside to me, thank you very much, 4 citadel hits, 2 target hits, 47,000 damage, and that Iowa is absolutely hurting. Not only that, but after I fire my salvo, just turn back, maintain my angle, and you'll hear the AP shots mostly bounce. The great thing about the Tirpitz in this particular situation is that I'm probably going to get into a situation where I'm going to expose a broadside as well to this Iowa. And this Iowa, well, its 16-inch guns hurt a hell of a lot more than my main guns. So what I did is I fired off a salvo of torpedoes. One, I'm saying, okay, if you do turn, you're going to take torpedoes. And with the amount of HP you have, you can't really take torpedoes. But 2, the other thing is I'm, in essence, zoning him out. By throwing torpedoes there, I'm pushing this Iowa away. This Iowa will not turn around while there are torpedoes heading towards him. And that allows me to not have to worry about the battleship, and I can focus on dealing with this Atago, because this Atago is actually a pretty big threat because it's got torpedoes. And at close range, the Japanese torpedoes can be pretty lethal against the battleship. So 1, I'm isolating the Iowa, pushing him away. 2, I am trying to basically minimize the accuracy that the Atago can have when it uses its torps by sort of pointing my bow at him, then turning away, then turning in, turning away, that kind of thing. So at this particular time, I'm looking at the map and I'm like, oh, there's an island there. These 2 ships, this Atago and this Iowa, are both sort of heading in the northwesterly direction. If I follow them, I will put myself in a dangerous position because, again, the Atago has torps on the other side. So instead, what I choose to do is I choose to use the great speed of the Tirpitz, and I mentioned this before, the speed of this battleship is phenomenal, to go on the outside of the island and then cut them off essentially when they clear the island to the north. Not only that, but the Tirpitz's great speed also allows it to zone out or flank other ships. And in this particular case, if you look at the battle, the most reasonable place, honestly, for the enemy team to go, had I been in a slow battleship, would probably to have cleared that island and then immediately turned to the east, and so heading towards the D9, D10 areas. If they went this way, they would have created an isolated fight for themselves, fighting only myself and one cruiser. But because the Tirpitz is relatively fast, I'm able to prevent them from coming out in this direction because they will take hits. So they had really no choice but to turn towards D7 and D6. So in this particular battle, the Tirpitz's speed allowed me to zone out the enemy ships from coming to a certain area. Not only that, but also allowed me to encircle them with my team. Because if you look at the map right now, there are cruisers in other directions, making the fight very difficult for this enemy team because they've constantly got to worry about shells coming in from more than one direction. So right now I am dealing with two of these enemy ships running away from me, and when they're running away, it's not really easy to do much damage in a battleship because their armor is usually quite angled. When they did expose moments of flatter armor, I did take shots, and they're putting almost 9,000 damage into the Iowa, which is substantial because the Iowa doesn't exactly have a lot of HP. But the role for me right now has evolved a little bit because initially I was sort of the big damage dealer, and now I'm more playing the role of, in a way, just being that threatening force that's forcing the enemy team to play into areas they don't want to be in, because they don't really want to show me too much of a flat surface because, once again, I will most likely make them pay for it. So even here, the Iowa is trying to shoot at me, but the damage is not great. As you heard, many of the shells there ricocheted, and when the Iowa does sort of expose a somewhat flatter side, I do try to put some shots into it. But in this particular case, the Iowa wasn't as tempting because it turned away, but the Otago had turned in and showed me a broadside. So like many of the cruisers as you saw earlier, I will make this Otago pay. And right there, right into the Citadel, dead Otago. So you know, the battle ends up being a win, but the Iowa I never really get to kill because he kind of runs away. Do manage to bag myself that Colorado though. So that battle netted me about 660,000 credits. I made 6,308 experience with the 1.5, doing 169,000 damage. Also managed to get myself a Confederate, High Caliber, and the Dreadnought medals. Well, this was definitely one of my better battles. A lot of my Tirpitz battles do end up being quite decent, so I think it is definitely possible to do well in this particular ship. Well, what's the verdict? Is she worth buying? And the answer to that question is, I would say yes. I personally found the Tirpitz to be a very good, very balanced battleship to play. She certainly got her strengths when it comes to things like survivability and her rate of fire and even the torps. But of course, the Tirpitz does have its disadvantages as well. Her rather low citadel damage, her rather poor dispersion, and her not so good AA fit. But other than that, I do think the Tirpitz is a solid tier 8 premium battleship that if you're looking for something like this, she is definitely worth buying. And that's all, folks, for this review on the Tirpitz. Hopefully I've been able to show you her strengths, her weaknesses, and everything in between, and you have now been able to come up with the decision whether to purchase this beautiful ship or not. One last thing before I sign off for the day. I have no idea when the ship is going to go on sale on the NA server, but I'm probably going to guess maybe within the next few weeks, so do keep your eyes open for that. Of course, if you like what I'm doing, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more ship reviews in the future. Have yourselves a fantastic day, and I look forward to seeing you all on the high seas in your Tirpitzes.